We can worship according to Yahweh's word, or we can worship according to man's tradition.
Emperor Constantine, a sun worshiper, solidified the change from Sabbath to Sunday. In the first 300 years of the New Testament, the church made hundreds of changes in doctrine.
It's time that we follow Scripture and not the traditions of man. Hey, this is Pastor Randy. I'd like to welcome you to Shattering Traditions, a program dedicated to really unveiling and understanding Yahweh's Word. Where today we have a very, very special guest with us, Elder Don Esposito, all the way from the land of Israel. You, I guess, got here last night.
Yes.
Such a blessing to see you again. And I guess 2016 was the last time we saw one another. Of course, we've stayed in touch through email mainly, but it's just a great seeing you again. You led our last tour in the land of Israel. Tell us, or the audience, a little bit about yourself before we begin, and maybe who you are, maybe a length of time you've been in Israel, and a little bit about your ministry.
Originally, as you know, I come from the Church of God background. I was there from around 1980, the early 1980s. Was ordained a pastor in 1994, and went to Israel in 1997. And we've been there for about 20 years. Met my wife actually over there and got married. That's another story for another day.
Very nice wife and family, by the way. I can vouch for that.
Thank you. And I really feel blessed being over there that I've had the opportunity to work in archaeology almost from the time I got there. Our guide was archaeologist for more than 40 years, found some of the biggest finds that were there. And it's really, what you see with archaeology, it's really confirming the Bible. So where there's traditions, there's 9 traditions where John the Baptist lost his head. Can you imagine losing your head 9 times? And you find a lot of this stuff is Byzantine. A lot of this stuff is just traditions, just like what we're going to talk about today with the Temple Mount. So going in the archaeology, you could really firsthand see what's being found, because so much of it has to deal with who is the archaeologist who's writing the report at the end. So being there firsthand, I really feel it's such a blessing in my life that I can see these things firsthand. I don't have to take somebody's opinion on it, that I can really see it and see what's happening on the ground.
Yeah. Well, certainly your experience in Israel is valued and is appreciated here. So today, as you sort of made mention of, we're going to be talking about the temple. And many people, the traditional belief, and I would say by the vast majority, is that the temple was originally on the Temple Mount today, which again sits along the east side of the city of Jerusalem. You can see it very well from the Mount of Olives. Now, we believe here something different, and I'm going to confess here to the audience, I was very resistant to this belief early on, and some of the folks here at this ministry can vouch for that. But we were in Israel 2016. We did an interview on the top of the Mount of Olives, looking down to the city of Jerusalem and also to the city of David, as we'll talk about quite a bit. And, you brought up many good points and very valid points. And for me, which I'm sure we'll go into more in detail, for me it was probably Fortress Antonia. Matter of fact, I again have to confess, when you sent your schedule over, I don't know if you remember this, you had Fortress Antonia. And I said, "Where's Fortress Antonia?" Of course, I think we know where Fortress Antonia is today. But it is a very important belief, I believe, and could have impact even on prophecy. And for the record, I just want to sort of dispel something from the very beginning. We've been called anti-Semites. We've been called Holocaust deniers. Oh, wow. Absolutely. It's unbelievable. And, we very much support the Jewish people, support the Jewish nation. I just want everybody to know that up front. This is not an attack on the Jews. This is simply looking at the facts for what they are. And giving an alternate view on where the temple was likely located. So with that, why don't you maybe give a little bit of history, not too long, but some history as to how you discovered this, and maybe you can open up the discussion by talking about the city of David and the connection
maybe I could
to the
just
temple.
Hold this book
Absolutely.
up. The temples that Jerusalem forgot, because this was not my theory. I did not come up with this. I read the book by Ernest Martin. You could see it's a very thick book.
It is. As a matter of fact, I read that book when we came back from the land of Israel. First book I read, and then I read a few others in addition to that. But it's very well documented, thoroughly documented.
Yes.
And he provides most of the quotes right within the book. And one of the things I did, just as a side note, is I went back and I authenticated all the quotes he
Wow.
has within that book. And,
Wow.
he really did incredible research.
Yeah, what's amazing, when I read it, I was expecting a slanted view from him, that he would come up with one kind of concept and then push his view on it. And I was shocked when it was the total opposite. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of direct quotes in there. And after reading it, again, it was something, it didn't matter to me either way, probably like you're just looking at the truth of something. So as the years went by, because I'm living there, you just see more and more things coming up. And even in the last couple of years, it's amazing. Like they found a Roman bathhouse right across from where they're calling the Temple Mount. And you're like, how on earth can they ever have a Roman bathhouse, maybe 20 yards from where the temple is supposed to be?
Now, that's right near the Wailing Wall.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right in that area over there. They found a couple of years ago also a sewer system that is coming all the way down from the Pool of Siloam. So would it make sense that you're going to go in mikvah for the temple, down in the Pool of Siloam, the biggest mikvah in the world? They say was an acre big, 10,000 people mikvah in there. And then you're going to walk a third of a mile over a sewage drain and get yourself defiled again.
Yeah.
So all these little things just kept coming more and more. And I can honestly say, I think it's now about 15, 16 years that I've been researching on this. I've never even found one fact remotely that would make me think that the temple was not in the city of David.
Well, when you look at Josephus, Eusebius, Epiphanius, Aristius, Tacitus, so many of these historians and quotes from antiquity, it really does. It's just, again, I was very, very skeptical, but after looking at the evidence, it was not hard to see. And I think if most people would look at the same evidence without any preconceived notions or biases, they would come to the same conclusions as we have. So let's just jump right into it, because we don't have a lot of time today.
Sure.
And so for me, it was Fortress Antonia. We'll look at that later. But probably the best place to start with is the city of David. You live there. Someone let you describe this. Give us a description of the geography. Talk about the Kidron Valley, the Ethiopian Valley, maybe the Valley of Hinnom, the Temple Mount area, the city of David. Explain where all that is located.
Okay. If you looked at Jerusalem from a topographical view, it looks almost like a Hebrew shin. You have the Mount of Olives, and then you have the Kidron Valley, and then you have the Mount Moriah, which would be from the city of David going up toward where the Temple Mount's a mountain range. Then you have the Tyrophium Valley in between there, and then you have the upper, which is called today Upper Mount Zion, which was never Mount Zion before. So it almost looks like a shin from the top, with the two valleys, the three mountains and the two valleys in between. And it's interesting because Josephus, and I think it's Tacitus also says this, they give a very interesting calculation on where the temple was. They say it's on a crescent-shaped ridge. One, I think, even calls it a theater, like a Greek theater, semicircle. When you look topographically, you could see only the city of David is on a ridge like that. Where the current Temple Mount is, it's not the Haram. The other thing that's interesting is where they say Josephus exaggerated, because he talks about the temple being 450 feet high and up to 600 feet in the southeast corner, where the corner of it was that they had there. That's like a 45-story building. There's no way they have technology to build something like that. And they said, oh, he's exaggerating, until you go there and realize, no, the temple is in the city of David. And because the Kidron Valley slopes like that, from the bottom of the Kidron Valley up there is easily 450 to 600 feet.
And you showed that to us when we were there, and you can see it.
Yes.
You can see how that's possible.
And even for the fact of the people living in the wall, like the walls were built from the base of the Kidron, stepstoned going all the way up.
Now, I'll note one more thing. The Gihon Spring is located right along the side of the Kidron Valley.
Yes.
And right at the beginning, really, the city of David, which would make a lot of sense. So one thing to point out is archaeologists, correct me if I'm wrong, but most archaeologists believe that the current city of David site, the national park site, was the original city of David. Is that generally
I've never heard anybody
understood?
doubt. But the interesting point is, when we say the Temple Mount could never be wrong, well, if we only go back to before 1880, a little over 100 years ago, nobody knew that was the city of David.
Yeah, yeah.
Everybody thought Mount Zion was in the upper city, and it was only when General Warren came in there, and then the Arab boy who went through the shaft there, and they found
there.
and they found the plaque, that they realized this is the city of David. So can you imagine Mount Zion, the most important place in Scripture, that they didn't even know that was Mount Zion.
Yeah. Or even today, they think Mount Zion's to the west, the ridge to the west of that, the other hill there,
Yes.
the upper city, as they noted. So you're right. 100 years ago, they would have never known about the city of David, and I think the same thing is true about the Temple Mount. Matter of fact, the finding of city of David has really changed the debate. It
Yes.
really has changed the debate, and we know from Scripture that Zion, and we know that Zion is also the place of where the temple was located. Most scholars don't debate that, by the way. If you would ask where was the temple, they're going to say Zion, because
Yes.
the Bible does.
Mount Zion.
Or what's amazing, though, is the Bible also connects Zion with the city of David.
Yes.
And, for me, I think we could read these few quotes from Scripture and probably just stop. And because I think that the evidence is sufficient to show that the city of David, which again we know is about a third of a mile south from the current Temple Mount,
Yes.
or the Haram, as the Arabs call it today. One of the examples is 2 Samuel 5 verse 7. It says, "Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, the same as the city of David." So we see a connection here between the Zion and the city of David. We see the same thing in Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 11, verse 5, it says, "And the inhabitants of Jebus said to David," of course that was the Jebusites before David conquered the city, "Thou shalt not come hither." Nevertheless, David took the castle or the stronghold of Zion, which is the city of David. So again, we see a connection there between between the city of David, Jerusalem,
Yes.
and Zion.
Yes.
And the fact that we know where, again, the city of David, the ancient city of David, was located, so Scripture shows.
Yeah, and I think where the problem comes in, like I said, the fact that maybe the most important place in all of Israel, Mount Zion in the city of David, was only known a little over 100 years ago, that how that current Temple Mount came to be. It was only from the medieval times when the Jews started coming back in the 1300s, and they're thinking after the Crusaders that that's the place where the temple was, and this mishap comes. But then after hundreds and hundreds of years of that, and even modern times now, where you got to remember, when Israel becomes a nation in 1948, they don't have the old city, right? It wasn't until the Six-Day War in 1967, they risked their life, they go in there, amazing story. They wouldn't even go in the old city without a rabbi coming with the Torah scrolls. They had to pray there first. And to come out and say you're praying to a Roman wall, it's a concept that is going to be virtually impossible for Jewish people to get. So that's why I'm saying you're dealing with all this tradition through there. But if you take all that aside and you just look at the facts, very clearly there's no doubt about it, because one of the things that we're told by several of the historians, and Aristeas that actually saw the temple, was about this inexhaustible spring of water coming up from underneath the temple. So there's only one spring. The Gihon spring is the only natural spring in Israel. It's there in the city of David. It's a special spring that there's only about a dozen of them in the whole world, a siphon spring, because of the way it gushes up and then it goes and fills the water and it runs down for the temple usage. And if you understand the concept, Psalm 29, Yahweh sits above the waters, that everything dealing with Yahweh has to deal with life, and it all starts with living water. That's why the priests had to use living water for the purification of the red heifer and different things over there. Not in a million years would they ever think of building a temple a third of a mile away from the only water source.
Now, some will say, and I bring this up because I want to acknowledge what Scripture says and also some of the opposition to this. Yes. Some will point out that there are cisterns underneath the current Temple Mount. And
yes.
there is. There's no debate about that. There's many, many cisterns. The issue, from my viewpoint, is where did the water come from to fill those cisterns during the time of Solomon? We know that during the time of the Romans, that the Romans built aqueducts. I believe it was from Bethlehem, I believe.
From Bethlehem.
And so they had water coming in from Bethlehem to the Temple Mount, which would fill the cisterns and give them water. But prior to that, where would Solomon get the water?
He wouldn't, and that's the point. Like some people that will bring opposition to this, they'll say, well, there's an aqueduct that's coming from Bethlehem that came over to where they're calling the Temple Mountain. That's where they got their water from to fill the cisterns. Well, that is true to a degree. Number one, though, it's not living water, so it wouldn't be able to be used for the mikvahs and whatnot. And number two, the aqueduct is only there from the time of the Romans. There is no aqueducts in the time of Solomon. So when Solomon, the original person who's building the temple, he's not thinking of an aqueduct coming from 5 kilometers away down in near Bethlehem. He's thinking of the only living water source in Jerusalem. And when we look at the other scriptures, right, because remember, the temple was not something that was just made as like a synagogue, just as a place to worship. The temple is where Yahweh's dwelling. The temple is millennial. It's beyond. It's showing the eternal existence, right, of Yahweh. So everything is dealing, like I said, with that living water. And the fact that we have in Ezekiel 47 and Revelation 22 talking about in the millennial temple that there's an inexhaustible spring of water underneath the temple that comes up and even goes down to the Dead Sea and makes the Dead Sea water fresh again. There's no way on earth that Solomon would have ever put that temple anywhere but in the city of David.
Well, the problem is you had thousands upon thousands of sacrifices, especially during the holy days. And,
yes.
And would they actually transport all that water from the Gihon spring up a third of a mile uphill? Because,
no way.
As we'll talk about, the Temple Mount is on the third highest hill, which Josephus makes reference of. I don't see it either. Let me read. I want to read the account from...
Let me make one more point on that, though, because another thing that people try to write in is because it talks about in 1 Kings where we know that there was a tabernacle of David, where David put the tabernacle before the temple was built. And then it says, when Solomon built the temple, they took the Ark of the Covenant out of the tabernacle of David, out of the city of David, and brought it up to the temple. And people say, you see, the temple's not in the city of David, because they don't understand the structure of Jerusalem at that time. And it's important to understand this, or you're going to miss the point, that you have two hills. One is called the Akra. That's where the Jebusite city was, where David had his citadel. And then next to that, you had a small hill called the Ophel. The Ophel is where the temple was built. In between the two of them was a little small valley type called Millo, which means fill in. So Solomon filled that in, and he connected it into one ridge. So originally, that ridge of the Ophel was not part of the city of David until Solomon filled it. And Psalm 122:1 says, Jerusalem is a city built to itself or compacted to itself. So right there, you know. So if anyone ever brings that scripture up to you, that they brought the Ark of the Covenant, of course, because we even know where the Tabernacle of David is. They found it today. That they brought it up from there. And actually, I believe I can show you exactly where even Solomon's temple was, because they've been doing digging there with Alat Mazar. And if you look at her report, and I have the report, how big was the temple? How long was the temple? It was 90 feet, right? 60 cubits, which is 90 feet long. Well, the structure they found right on the other side of the Millo is exactly 90 feet. All the dimensions fit, and she even puts in her report, she says, this could be the temple, but if it was, we'd have to change everything we know about the temple. I'm like, yeah, that's what you need to do. But if you look at that report, so that's why never let somebody bring that scripture up about bringing the Ark of the Covenant out of the city of David, because yes, that Ophel was originally not part of the city of David, but once Solomon built it together, then it all became the city of David.
We understand the geography is so important. That's why I sort of began with you explaining the geography of Jerusalem, because originally, as you point out, and Scripture talks about Solomon filling in the Millo. So this is not something we're making up. This is not something this is not conjecture.
And we know where the Millo is. From 1960, Catherine Kenyon, she identified the Millo. So we know where that is.
Well, the thing is, and we were there, you know, when you go to the city of David, you can actually see the Millo, because the stones are different. They're very small Solomonic stones versus the other stones around are very, very different. You can see the Millo, the shape of the Millo, and to me, there's no doubt that's where the Millo is. I think the geology there confirms that for sure.
And you want to know something? We know from Josephus that there was two colonnades, right? From the corner of Fort Antonio that was 600 feet long that came to the temple area. Where Elat Mazar was digging, the area that's the same exact size, they found this gigantic wall. They're calling it the large stone structure. She thinks it's David's citadel. I believe it's the temple, is exactly 600 feet from that wall.
Where there's a scripture I want to share in Psalm 76, verse 2, it says this, "And Salem also is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion." And I draw two important points here. Number one, it shows Salem, which Salem is an old name for the city of Jerusalem. And we know Jerusalem was also the city of David. So there's a connection between Salem, Jerusalem, city of David, all the same thing. It says also is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion. So we see that where Yahweh's dwelling place is in Zion.
Yes.
And we also see Zion is where? Is in Salem.
Yes.
Is in the city of David, Jerusalem. And as you pointed out, and I think it's so important from a historical standpoint that people understand this, that the original city of David was only the Akra or Mount Zion,
Yes.
did not extend onto the Ophel until Solomon filled in the Millo.
Exactly.
And once Solomon filled in the Millo, he enlarged the city of David or Jerusalem. But prior to that, the city of David was about 12 acres in size,
Yes.
which is quite a bit smaller even the Temple Mount. And that's one thing I wonder how many people realize.
It actually even mentions it in Scripture that David took the stronghold from Millo inward.
Mm-hmm, it does.
Yep.
It absolutely does. And that's such an important point to realize. Or you were also mentioning, and I wanted to read the reference because this was another historical fact that just sort of blew me away, is we do see evidence of a gushing spring
Yes.
within the temple. And Eusebius counts Aristeas' remarks. He says, "There is an inexhaustible reservoir of water as would be expected from an abundant spring gushing up naturally from within. There being moreover wonderful and indescribable cisterns underground and 5 furlongs according to their showing all around the foundation of the temple and countless pipes from them, so that the streams on every side meet together. And all these have been fastened with lead at the bottom of the side walls, and over these has been spread a great quantity of plaster, all having been carefully wrought." So we see that, according to Eusebius, this is again on Aristeas' account of the temple, which, by the way, Aristeas was an Alexandrian Jew.
Yes.
Lived about 2nd century BC, according to scholarship. So this was 200 years. So probably, from what I understand, probably around the Zerubbabel's temple. And but we know the temple location never changed. We
Yes.
know that where Solomon built, Zerubbabel fixed, if you will, and then Solomon built, or Herod enlarged it from there. But it was always in the same location. And Aristeas says that there was an inexhaustible spring coming up from the temple.
Yes.
And the reality is this is an impossibility on the Temple Mount. There's no way the temple could be on the Temple Mount if there was a spring gushing up
No,
from the temple.
because there's only one spring in the area, and that spring is the Gihon.
So for me, that really is just a clincher. Matter of fact, just one other historical quote. This is from Tacitus. He was a Roman historian.
Yes.
And he says the temple resembled a citadel. A citadel is a stronghold.
Yep.
And we know that's because you had the Tyropian Valley on one side, you had the Kidron Valley on the other side. So it really was a natural area for guarding the city.
Yes.
It said it had its own walls, which were more laboriously constructed than the others. Even the colonnades with which it was surrounded formed an admirable outwork. It contained an inexhaustible spring. There were subterranean excavations in the hill and tanks and cisterns for holding rainwater. The founders of the state had foreseen that frequent wars would result from the singularity of its customs, and so had made very provision against the most protracted siege. So we see, number one, he also speaks about this spring-like reservoir gushing up, but he also mentions subterranean excavations and cisterns. And that's one of the things you do see within the city of David. And, I've been there twice, and of course you've been there how many times?
100.
and you see that.
Yes.
And that's the other remarkable thing when you read Tacitus and Aristeas, or Eusebius' account of Aristeas, and both of them talk about this gushing spring. Both of them talk about these subterranean tunnels.
Yes.
You don't see that on the Temple Mount.
No.
You really don't. So that's another. And by the way, Tacitus, I've already mentioned he was a Roman historian, but he dates to about 2nd century CE. So we have 400 years separating Aristeas and Tacitus, one being a Jew, one being a Roman. But remarkably, they both confirm the same thing.
Yes, exactly. And it's interesting because sometimes people say, well, the temple isn't there anymore, so how can you know? And we know from Josephus and other writings, as a matter of fact, maybe I'll read one here.
Yeah, absolutely.
He says, I cannot but wish that we had all died before we had seen the holy city demolished by the hands of our enemies, or the foundations of our holy temple dug up after so profane a manner. And it goes on and on and on here of different...
Well, read a few quotes if you would.
Okay, maybe I'll continue then. This one is from Eusebius, that it says, the hill called Zion in Jerusalem, the buildings there, the temple, the Holy of Holies, the altar, and whatever else there was dedicated to the glory of God has been utterly removed or shaken in fulfillment of the word. So there's so many proofs here. I'm trying to see if you have the one from Josephus from Masada. Okay, maybe I'll read this one here. And where is now that great city, the metropolis of the Jewish nation, which was fortified by so many walls around it, which had so many fortresses and large towers to defend it, which could hardly contain the instruments prepared for the war, and which had so many 10,000s of men to fight in it? Where is the city that is believed to have Elohim himself inhabiting therein? It is now demolished to the very foundations. It has nothing left but that monument of it preserved. I mean the camp of those that had destroyed it. So here it is. All the records are saying that Jerusalem and the temple completely destroyed, including the outer walls, right? Just like Yeshua said, prophesied, not a stone will be left upon another. And yet, where they're calling the Temple Mount there today, you have more than 10,000 Herodian stones. And the interesting part about it is not everything was destroyed in Jerusalem, as we just read here. There was one thing that was not destroyed. The edifice, the Fort Antonia. Now, you go there today, right? You're not going to find the temple because the temple was destroyed. You can find just the foundation that's there, the foundation stone. But you can find Fort Antonia. Mm-hmm. And every fort, right, because it's Roman property, is a certain size. It's 1,200 feet by 600 feet. You go there, and what do you find? Where they're calling the Temple Mount is 1,200 feet by 600 feet, about 3% different because of the rock formation. And you see that Josephus tells us Fort Antonia was associated with this large precipitous rock that's 75 feet high, and the rock is there today. Matter of fact, just a couple of years ago, they actually hit the foundation of that rock, that you could see it from the foundation coming. So you don't have to guess anymore. It's there. You can see it with your eyes. So forget the traditions and all the other things involved with it. All you have to do is read the account. You go there, and you can see Fort Antonia, because Fort Antonia is still there today.
Well, for me, that quote is such a remarkable quote, because it confirms the only thing that remained, as you read, was a Roman camp. And if you go to Israel today, the only major monument or structure that remains for that time period is the Temple Mount.
And you know what's interesting about it? Because why did that camp remain? Because it was decided that the Fort Antonia was going to be the outpost for the 10th Legion. And not many people know this, but I know the archaeologist who was doing the digging, the surfing of things underneath the Temple Mount, and I've seen a picture of it. They actually found a commemoration stone for Flavius Silver from the 10th Legion, right there at the Haram. So wow, talk about a smoking gun. The very commemoration stone for the commander of the 10th Legion, they find where? They find there at the Haram.
No, I mean, it's a very, very important point, because again, there are no other structures, there are no other monuments, as Josephus says here, except for the Temple Mount, or what they call the Temple Mount.
Yes.
And the fact that Josephus confirms that everything was obliterated.
Yes.
The temple was obliterated. The city of Jerusalem was obliterated. The only thing that remained after Titus came through was the Roman fort, which makes sense, because as you pointed out, I think it was 200 years. 200 more years, the 10th Legion was stationed right there in Jerusalem. They actually changed the name later. But yeah, from a historical standpoint, Josephus confirms that the only thing that was there after this destruction was a Roman fort. And the only thing there today of that time frame is is what
Roman
they
fort.
call the Temple Mount, or
Yes.
what we believe is Fortress Antonia. I want to read Joshua's remarks, his prophecy, because it really is important that we understand this. In Mark 13, verse 1 through 2, I think this may be from the NIV, it's a bit clearer. It says, and he went out of the temple. One of his disciples said unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. They were real impressed with this. They were just, wow, how impressive are these stones and these walls and these buildings. And then Joshua answered, said unto him, seest thou these great buildings? There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. Matter of fact, I think that's from the King James, the word thou was an indicator. But here we see Joshua saying that not one stone would remain upon another. Now, one of the things, and again, this is where geography sort of helps, is important to realize and understand is where they were standing.
Yes.
This prophecy is called the Mount of Olives. Why? Because it was given on the Mount of Olives.
Exactly.
So if you're standing on the Mount of Olives, as we were when we were in Israel and with you in 2016, and you're looking down onto the city of Jerusalem, you see the full Temple Mount area, what they call the Temple Mount. Joshua says that not one stone would remain. He also says here great buildings.
Yep.
And the reason I bring this up is many people, they'll say Joshua was simply referring to the inner sanctuary, that he wasn't referring to the outer wall, because they have a real dilemma. And, you've heard this for many years. I had my explanation. Matter of fact, my explanation was Joshua was referring only to the inner sanctuary, because you have to explain why the Wailing Wall remains.
Exactly. But like you said, when you're on the Mount of Olives, you can't even see all the buildings. The main thing you're seeing is the outer wall.
Yeah, absolutely. But, as we may get to, the historians talk about how even the foundation stones were dug up.
Yes.
And yet you look at the foundation of the Temple Mount, and it's pristine. It's amazing how well preserved it is. So this concept of a well-preserved foundation, along with this large Wailing Wall or Western Wall remaining, does not fit the prophecy Joshua gave. Joshua, again, he's looking back from the Mount of Olives onto the Temple Mount area, or Fortress Antonia, or the entire city, really. And, he says not one stone would remain, and he says not one building would remain.
Yes.
And so this concept that he's referring only to the inner sanctuary just simply does not fit with the prophecy he gave.
Exactly. And the historians have one other problem, is when you look at those walls that are there, right? The base of those walls are Herodian stones. Nobody doubts that. So those stones have to be from the 1st century. Yet, when we're looking at the temple, right? Solomon's temple is destroyed 586 BC, right? And then in the book of Nehemiah, he goes back there, right? And he can't even get his donkey through the Kidron Valley because all these stones are there. But what is he there to do? He's there to rebuild those walls. So now he's rebuilding those walls with the Solomonic stones that are down in the valley. He's not going and getting new stones. And even if he did, they wouldn't be Herodian stones. So now he rebuilds that. And like you mentioned a little bit ago, you have Solomon's temple, and then you have the rebuilt temple by Zerubbabel, and then you have Herod expanding the temple. Nowhere does it ever say, though, that Herod would take the whole wall down, take every stone away, and then rebuild the stones from scratch. Nowhere does it mention anything. So the point of it is the base of that wall should be Solomonic stones, because whatever was built on top that Herod would build, the base of it is Solomonic stones. I've mentioned that to people for years, and their answer always was, well, it goes further underneath here. From what you see, the Wailing Wall, it goes down. At the base, they're Solomonic stones. Well, a couple of years ago, we know now, they went down to bedrock, and they're Herodian stones. There's no Solomonic stones there whatsoever. So clearly, that is a big smoking gun. Because what happened to all the stones of the wall from Solomon?
Yeah.
Did they just disappear? There's no way that structure could be where the temple was, because if it was, there would have to be a base. Even if it's only 10 feet, there has to be a base of Solomonic stones.
Matter of fact, a fairly well-known archaeologist, Eli Shukran, which again, he was our guide the first trip, and just a phenomenal guy, and very down to earth. But matter of fact, the week I was there, he made front news on Fox News, major discovery. But anyway, he discovered a coin.
Yes.
Near the base, or the base of the Wailing Wall there, and it dated back to about Agrippa II.
Yeah, 19.
So based on evidence, Herod himself did not build that wall. Now, some will point out, or the temple was still in the process of being built. But again, it just doesn't add up. The facts, the historical facts that we know, does not add up, as you said. And I've been down there. You showed it to me. Ellie showed it to me.
Yep.
There are no the Solomonic stones at the base of the old wall there.
Yep.
All you have is Herod. And Herod's stones are very unique.
Yes.
He would have a sort of a frame around a pitcher. And so you could very easily tell a Herodian stone versus a Solomonic stone.
Yes.
And you don't see Solomonic stones.
Yep.
But you do see, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think we do see Solomonic stones in the Millo.
Oh, definitely.
Within the city of
Yeah,
David, which would make sense if that was the city of David.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And that's why even not only do they find Solomonic stones there, they actually found in the last couple of years as they're digging, they found the tower that Nehemiah built. How do they know it? Because there's Persian pottery, there's Persian oil lamps, and only from the time that Nehemiah was alive. So again, and you just read the book of Nehemiah, where is he going? He's building the wall all around the city of David, the steps going down to the pool of Siloam, coming up on the other side. That's where the wall is being built. And when you're there, it really makes sense, because from the Mount of Olives, if you're looking, we know he's building around the city of David because they tell us that. You can look and see if he had to build all the way around where they're calling the Temple Mount, you're talking about maybe a mile of building in 52 days that he's going to do. It would be impossible.
It really would be, and no one really has an answer for that. I want to read one more source here from Eusebius. This is in reference to the destruction of the temple. It says, "Their ancient holy place, at any rate, and their temple are to this day as much destroyed as Sodom." Now, just as a side note, one of the other places we got to visit with you was the ancient site of Gomorrah.
Yes.
And that's a phenomenal site because you see the ash. Matter of fact, where we found a few sulfur balls there, which I think are completely unique to that area. So more than likely, I believe that was the city of Gomorrah. But either way, we know that Sodom and Gomorrah were completely obliterated.
Yes.
And according to Eusebius, again, a very well-known church historian, he says here that the destruction of the temple was as bad as, is as severe as what Sodom suffered. And we know that, again, Gomorrah suffered a similar fate. So the fact that it appeared as Sodom, again, how do you explain the pristine foundation of the Wailing Wall or the Temple Mount? How do you explain the Wailing Wall if supposedly this looked as Sodom after Titus came through? It doesn't fit.
Yes. No, and they could say Josephus exaggerated, but like you said, you're going here with Eusebius, Josephus, Eleazar, the New Testament, Yeshua. You're going reference after reference, all showing that they even mention some of these references that it was dug until the foundation. So some of them say Jerusalem was a city that didn't even look like it ever was a city before, and yet it says the only thing that was there was that one edifice, the Fort Antonia.
Well, to me, that sort of seals it. Beyond what Scripture says about the city of David, which is Zion, and we know again Zion is where the temple was.
Yes.
And then we can read about the quote from Josephus saying the only thing that remained was the monument. I don't know how you could ever believe that the temple was located on the traditional Temple Mount as so many do today. I want to move on and talk about, because many people believe that the temple is underneath the Dome of the Rock, underneath the Haram, or again, what I would call the traditional Temple Mount. There's several issues with that, though. Maybe you can speak to those.
Yeah, well, first of all, when we're looking at the temple, right, whether you're looking at the Bible, where Yahweh, to the centimeter, is telling exactly, because it's a pattern from heaven, how it has to be made. Then you go to all the Jewish writings. You can go to the Mishnah, the Talmud. There's so many Jewish writings. Josephus, who, again, in detail, saying what the Temple Mount looked like and what the temple looked like, to the point of even the top, there's these tiny little swords on the top, so pigeons can... to the last detail. In all the writings, never, ever, ever is there one thing ever mentioned about a 51 foot by 58 foot protruding rock. None, zero. And yet today, Jews will tell you that's the rock that Adam was created on. That's the rock where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. So today they have all their theories of it, right? But nothing is ever written anything about this gigantic protruding rock. Yet, when you come to the Fort Antonia, which again is called the rock because of the large protruding rock that's coming out of there. So the rock is associated with Fort Antonia, no rock associated with the temple. Now, let's look from that point on. Because in the 3rd, 4th century, a church is built around that rock, because that's where they believe was the praetorium, where Yeshua would get on top of that rock and give his defense
And
before
that makes
the governor.
sense. I think there's some credibility to that. That was
totally.
where the praetorium was located within
yeah,
the Fortress
without a shadow of a
Antonia.
doubt, because it's, I mean, there's the Bordeaux Pilgrim, there's things, people that wrote that they know that's where the praetorium was, because it actually says it, that they would surmount on top of that rock and give their defense. So now, at least by the 3rd and 4th century, we know that's what it's believed. How do we know? Because they put a church there. And they put a church there, and they put an octagonal church, because by the 4th century, they're using these octagonal churches, and they have 3 of them in Jerusalem. There's 7 I found throughout Israel.
Really a good example is not Caesarea, it's Capernaum.
Capernaum. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, it's just a great example of what that would have looked like.
Exactly. Starts out as the house of Peter, or the house of his mother-in-law, and by the 5th century, they're putting this octagonal church. And they're all the same size, which is really interesting. They made them the same size, and over there they're doing it because they're believing that's where Yeshua is going before Pilate, the Church of the Holy Wisdom, the Church of St. Cyril. Now what happens is, when the Persians come in the 7th century, and they're destroying the churches and turning them into mosques, they make that into a mosque. Later, the Crusaders come in, and they destroy the mosque and turn it back into a church, and they start calling it the Temple of Domini. And that's where, when the Jews come in only 50 years later after that, and they're seeing this is called the Temple of Domini, the Jews are starting to think that must be where the temple was.
And here's one fact that a lot of people don't realize is the Jews, they were dispersed and away from the land for about 1,000 years.
Yes.
I mean, there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, there were no Jews in the Holy Land for about 1,000 years. You lose a lot of perspective and information in 1,000 years.
What's interesting is, you're right that as a people they would disperse, but there were small groups of people that were in Israel, small groups of Jews. One group that's in Tiberias, right, where we were close to there, why are they in Tiberias? Because that's where the Sanhedrin goes to. So now, during that time in the 7th century, these Jews that are religious Jews from Tiberias are being allowed to come back to Jerusalem. And where do they come? You know what they say? They want to be where the temple stood during the time of King David. And where do they ask to go? To the city of David and the pool of Siloam. That's where they're claiming. And so most of the Jews are out of the land, haven't been there, but the ones that were there are claiming that's where the temple was.
And that really is a remarkable fact. And that was the Omar, the second caliph of Islam. I'm going to read that quote, actually, from Jerusalem Anthropology, page 148. And it says, Omar decreed that 70 households should come. They agreed to that. After that, he asked, where do you wish to live within the city? They replied, in the southern section of the city. Now, the southern section would be the city of David, which is the marketplace or market of the Jews. The request was to enable them to be near the site of the temple, and its gates, as well to the water of Shiloh or Shiloah, which could be used for immersion. And that's where you get talk about the living waters. This was granted them by the Emir of believers. So 70 households, including women and children, moved from Tiberias and established settlements and buildings whose foundations had stood for many generations. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, here we have these families. They evidently knew where the temple was.
Yes.
They knew where the city of David was.
Yes.
They specifically said, number one, we want to be in the southern section of the city. And number two, they point out here that the temple is located near the water of Shiloah or the pool of Shiloh.
Yes, exactly. And when the temple was destroyed, for a while it was even just a refuge dump that they had. There's almost like shaming of the people. So you're right, most of the Jews lost sight of where it was, but the religious ones never did. And that's why I believe, and this is my opinion, but I believe they're doing digging there for 20 years now. And I believe that the Jews know that that's the temple site. Because you don't hear so much about the Haram these days, but wow, everything they're doing in the city of David and what they're trying to uncover and what they're trying to get, I believe that they know that is the place of the temple. But again, you're dealing with a lot of tradition that you have to get through.
Or real quickly, too, another issue with the Dome of the Rock specifically is we know originally it was a threshing floor, the temple location. Or if you look at the Dome of the Rock, underneath the Dome of the Rock, the protruding rock is it's not flat.
No.
It's not smooth. and you have to have a smooth, flat surface if you're going to use it as a threshing floor. So even from a historical standpoint, knowing what its use was originally, it doesn't fit.
No. And yet, the place where Alat Mazar was digging, they found 130 of these little round holes that could be for grinding grain. And in the official report, they say that they could be for grinding grain, which would make perfect sense if that was a threshing floor.
So we're running out of time. I want to transition to a little bit more about Fortress Antonia. But we could really probably spend an entire day talking about the Fortress Antonia and where the temple stood. So you've already read the quote from Josephus that speaks about the only thing remaining was the Roman fort, or that monument that belonged to the Romans. Or we know that was Roman, the Fortress Antonia. Now we also know from Josephus, and I'm not going to read the account. I mean, if you want to read some of it, that's fine. But we know from Josephus that it was the Maccabees who built essentially the Temple Mount area, and it was a stronghold. Yeah, so they built that, and then Herod comes along. He further fortifies that, and he calls it after Mark Antony, Fortress Antonia. And we know that Josephus also confirms that the Roman fort was on the third highest hill.
Yes.
Now, you can look at the geography of Israel. You have, as you point out, the Akbar, the Ophel, and the Temple Mount, the traditional Temple Mount. And we know, just by visually looking at the area from the Mount of Olives, that the highest elevation is the Temple Mount, the traditional Temple Mount area, which, if Josephus is right, is not the Temple Mount, the original biblical Temple Mount, but was Fortress Antonia. The other thing we know is historians confirm that the 10th Legion was stationed there, and you mentioned that. But tell us a little bit about a legion, because this is, by the way, the thing that probably convinced me to really look into this. When you explained a legion versus a cohort, very, very important, because it doesn't make sense. And then if you can, also talk about the current model at the Israeli Museum.
Yes. Well, when you're looking at Fort Antonia, Josephus tells us that it was the size of a city, and not only the size of a city, the size of several cities, because you needed everything in there. And he says that there was a legion of troops there, and in some of the translations they put cohort, where every other place it's legion. A cohort is about 600 men. A legion is about 5,000 men. It's a big difference. The reason why they had to change it to cohort is when you're looking at, if you're putting what should be Fort Antonia as the Temple Mount, there's nowhere to put Fort Antonia because there's no space to the north of there. So like in the model at the Israeli Museum by Avi Yonah, they make this Fort Antonia into this, the size of the room maybe we're over here. And even 500 people would have a hard time fitting in there and living in there. But to put 5,000 troops in there would be virtually impossible. It just couldn't fit, you know. So when we're looking at the size of Antonia and, what was going on there, and again, the Jews and the Romans, they're not interacting with each other. You need everything. You need restaurants. You need cooks. You need, you name it. It had to be a large, like Josephus said, a large city like that. And without it. Now, this is confirmed in the New Testament because when the Apostle Paul is over there, and Paul, who's a nobody, they don't even know where he is. They're thinking he's this Egyptian guy who did this. They take, I believe it's 470 men to take him to Caesarea. Now, if you only had 600 men at the fort, and maybe they aren't even all there, maybe there's 500 at the time, that means you're leaving your fort defenseless to guard one guy who you don't even know who he is and isn't even important. Yeah. It would make absolutely no sense.
Just as a quick question, have you ever done the math on that?
I saw it in the paper.
It's in there. Yeah. 78%.
Yeah, exactly.
Now would the Romans give one man to take this person from Jerusalem to Caesarea? 78% of their military men. I just don't see it. Now, if you do the math, though, now that's based on a cohort, by the way.
Yes.
So if it's 600 men is most define a cohort. That would be 78%. Now, if you understand it correctly, as most historians will point out, the 10th Legion was a legion. Matter of fact, it comes from legio. Legio, Latin for legion. It was about 6,000 men.
Yes.
Okay, now you're talking 7%. Well, that makes a lot more sense than 70% of your military men to escort one man from point A to point B. I want to read Josephus as just a part of Josephus's account because this really is important. It comes from Wars of the Jews. And here's how he describes Fortress Antonia. He says, the inward parts had the largest and form of a palace, it being parted into all kinds of rooms and other conveniences such as courts, the places for bathing, broad places, spaces for camps, insomuch that by having all conveniences the cities wanted, it might seem to be composed of several cities. So that's how Josephus describes Fortress Antonia. And if you look again at this appendage, they show at the Israeli Museum, it can't possibly be right. And again, for me, this is what convinced me, because historians overwhelmingly confirm the fact that the 10th legion was a legion, not a cohort.
Yes.
And when you understand that fact, that one simple fact, and then when you look at the model, it doesn't make sense. So you have to ask, where were these men stationed? Where were they housed? And the only place that makes sense is is the current Temple Mount
And
area.
it's more than 200 years they're there. They're not just there overnight.
Exactly, and that's an important point. They were there for much longer. The other thing, too, is, and I'm not going to get into the weeds a whole lot anyway, but there's other discrepancies between Josephus and the model we have at the Israeli Museum. Number one, I think it's 75 cubits, is that right? For the southeast wall there, or not wall, but tower.
Yes.
You don't see that as the Israeli model.
No.
You talk about, the Greek says it was a stayed difference of 600 feet, connected by two colonnades. There are no colonnades there.
What they try to do is they try to take what's there today according to their theory, and that's where he's making the model from.
Yeah, it just... The other thing, too, or that's all they can do, the other thing, too, is Josephus says, if you're coming from the north, that Fortress Antonia obscured the view of the temple.
Yes.
Now, you've been, or you live there, I've been there. There's no way, coming from the north, that if Fortress Antonia is where they say it is, that would obscure the view of the temple. I mean, the view of the temple, being the Temple Mount area, would be much, much larger, and there would be no obstruction there. But if Fortress Antonia was located where the current Temple Mount is, and the temple was located on the Ophel, south of the current Temple Mount, alongside the city of David, or as part of the city of David after Solomon, it makes sense.
Yes.
Because you're coming from the north, because the current fortress, or where Fortress Antonia stood, and where the current traditional Temple Mount stands, it does obscure the city of David.
Exactly. Let me finish that quote that you were reading here. It says, there was also a peculiar fortress belonging to the upper city, which was Herod's palace, but for the hill Bethesda, it was divided from the tower Antonia, as we have already told you, and as that hill on which the tower of Antonia stood was the highest of the three, so it did adjoin to the new city, and was the only place that hindered the sight of the temple on the north.
Yep, there it is.
Now, there's two important things here. One is, like you're talking about, that the Fort Antonia had to hinder the temple, so it had to be north of there and cover it. The second thing is, it also says, but for the hill Bethesda, it was divided from the tower Antonia. So, and we were there, Bethesda is just north of what should be Fort Antonia. So if you're reading this and you're there, you see it, that couldn't have been the temple.
That's true. Yeah, that's a very good point. Well, and I think we have to draw this to a close. I regret that, because I enjoy talking about this so much, and especially with you.
Wow.
You've been looking at this much, much longer. You're the one that convinced me about 2 years ago to look into this. I've spent hundreds of hours since then. And, more you look at it, more convinced you become.
Exactly.
The proof is just overwhelming. And again, it's just great to see you again. It's been too long.
Yes.
So hopefully we won't wait 2 years this time. But again, thank you for being here.
Come over to
Thank you.
Israel.
Yeah, or if I can, I will. I told my wife after the first trip, I said, it's a good thing I married young. Because if not, I probably would have done what Don did. I would have just stayed. Because it feels like home.
Yes.
And there's nothing like going to the land of Israel. And it was a trip, I'd say trip of a lifetime, but I've done it twice, and I hope to do it a few more times in my lifetime. but it really is a great trip, and nothing makes the Bible come to life
Yes.
like going to Israel does. But anyway, thank you for being here. Thank you for the information.
Thank you, Randy.
And Yahweh bless you, and Yahweh bless your ministry.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you for watching and being part of this program. And we would encourage you to study this out. I know many of the things we've probably said today seems maybe peculiar, something you haven't heard before, but believe me, if you look into it, I believe you're going to come to the same conclusion we have. And that is that the current Temple Mount area within the city of Jerusalem today is not where the temple stood, but this is where the Fortress Antonia stood long ago. So again, I thank you for watching. May Yahweh bless you, and bye-bye.